In the year 1836, the town of Rottweil sat quietly along the edges of the Black Forest, a place where time seemed slower and shadows lingered longer. It was a community defined by ritual, church bells marking the hours, farmers bent over fields, neighbors bound by trust and silence. Yet beneath its calm exterior an unease simmered, whispered about only after nightfall. At the heart of that unease were two brothers, Carl and Matthias Hollow. By day, they were no different than any other men, tending livestock, mending fences, sharing bread at the tavern. But as dusk swallowed the horizon, their names became a warning. For the Hollow brothers, people said, did not belong wholly to this world. Rumors first surfaced in hushed voices, midnight gatherings in the woods where torchlight danced against bare trees. Contracts written in something thicker than ink, carvings etched into bone, hidden in barns or beneath floorboards. And when livestock began turning up dead, bodies unmarked, blood missing without a wound, the whispers grew louder. Children were warned never to stray past the Hollow farm. Travelers passing through the region recorded unease in their journals, describing a household where two voices seemed to speak as one. Even the air, they wrote, seemed heavier there. But it was not until people vanished, 3 townsfolk gone without a trace, that suspicion hardened into dread. The disappearances could not be explained by wolves or bandits. Doors were locked, yet families swore they heard knocking at midnight, followed by laughter that did not belong to any neighbor. Fear became the town's constant companion, and with it came stories. Some claimed Carl had lost his mind, dragging Matthias with him into delusion. Others insisted they had made a pact, an agreement with something unspeakable, a power that demanded blood in exchange for prosperity. And when crops around the Hollow land seemed healthier than any other, envy mingled with terror. The church declared the brothers heretics. Priests warned of unholy covenants, urging the town to purge the source of corruption before it spread. Early doctors, however, suggested madness, a shared psychosis, what they called folie à deux, where two minds fracture together. Yet neither explanation satisfied the villagers who swore they saw more than 2 shadows moving inside the Hollow farmhouse. Neighbors whispered the same chilling phrase. The brothers were never alone. The Hollow brothers became a riddle with no answer, a mirror reflecting the town's deepest fears, faith clashing with science, kinship twisting into something monstrous. Were they merely poor men unraveling under isolation? Or had they truly crossed into forbidden territory, drawing power from rituals carved into flesh and bone? What began as quiet suspicion soon spiraled into hysteria, sealing their legacy not as farmers, but as figures of terror. And in Rottweil, long after the Hollow farm rotted away, the story of Carl and Matthias still lingers like a curse, half memory, half nightmare. The story of Carl and Matthias Hollow cannot be understood without first descending into the soil from which they grew. Long before their names were whispered with fear, they were simply 2 boys born into hardship in the quiet town of Rottweil, a place that prized devotion, labor, and obedience. Their father, Heinrich Hollow, was a man of rigid discipline, carved by the unforgiving land and the doctrines of the Catholic Church. He believed in work above rest, punishment above forgiveness, silence above questioning. His sons grew up under his shadow, their days marked by calloused hands and their nights by the sting of a leather strap. To him, a child's spirit was something to be broken early, so that obedience might take root where curiosity once lived. Their mother, Anna, offered the only softness in their world. She was quiet, gentle, her presence like a flicker of warmth in a home otherwise ruled by cold authority. She sang hymns as she worked, her voice carrying through the farmhouse as if she were trying to remind her children that something beyond fear existed. But when Carl was 9 and Matthias only 7, Anna fell gravely ill. Her death was swift and merciless, and the Hollow household became a tomb where her absence echoed louder than her presence ever had. From that day forward, Heinrich became harsher, as if his grief turned to iron within him, leaving no space for tenderness. The loss left scars. For Carl, the elder, The void demanded control. He grew guarded, brooding, his gaze often lingering too long on things others dismissed. For Matthias, still small enough to cling to his mother's apron when she was alive, the death left him restless, desperate for something to hold on to. Together they became bound not only by blood, but by shared loneliness, each boy leaning into the other as the world pressed harder against them. Yet their closeness, forged by necessity, began to warp in ways subtle at first, then darker. The family's poverty deepened. Heinrich's farm yielded little, and debts gnawed at what little pride he had left. The boys were sent to labor long before their bones were ready for it, their shoulders bent under burdens meant for grown men. Isolation became their companion. Other children avoided them, not only because of their father's stern reputation, but because something about the Hollow brothers seemed different. They played less, smiled rarely, and often kept to themselves, whispering in corners as though sharing secrets meant only for the two of them. It was during these years that villagers began to notice their fascination with peculiar objects hidden among the family's possessions. In the barn, half buried beneath straw and forgotten tools, lay a wooden idol, its features crude, its eyes hollow, its shape unsettlingly human but distorted, as though the carver had known anatomy but chosen to twist it. No one knew how long it had been in the Hollow family, but old men in the tavern muttered that Heinrich's grandfather had brought it from some distant journey, a relic better left unremembered. When asked about it, Heinrich dismissed it as a trinket, useless and without meaning. But the brothers lingered near it, touching its rough surface, tracing its odd grooves with reverence they could not explain. There was also the book, a leather-bound volume filled with Latin inscriptions, its pages brittle and ink faded with time. The Hollow brothers could not read Latin, but they studied the symbols as though they were maps leading out of their misery. Some villagers claimed the book was a devotional, a simple relic of the church. Others insisted it bore markings of something older, stranger, its lines looping into shapes that resembled not prayers, but incantations. To Carl and Matthias, it was more than parchment. It was possibility. The boys' attachment to these heirlooms unsettled those who noticed. Children were supposed to play with sticks and stones, not murmur to carved idols or turn pages they could not understand. Yet the Hollow brothers were often seen huddled together in the barn, the book open before them, whispering phrases they had copied phonetically. At night, strange sounds drifted across the fields, low chants, sometimes laughter, sometimes something too rhythmic to be dismissed as mere play. When confronted, Heinrich beat them for their foolishness, but even he seemed wary of the relics, never daring to cast them into the fire. Loss, poverty, and isolation became the soil, but it was ritual that became the seed. The Hollow brothers, bound tightly by grief and their father's unrelenting hand, began to fashion a world of their own. In this world, the idol was not wood, it was a listener. The book was not faded Latin, it was instruction. The bond between brothers was not merely blood, it was a covenant. The rituals started as mimicry, gestures half-remembered from church, but bent into strange new shapes. They lit candles not in devotion but in secrecy. They spoke not prayers but sounds that felt like prayers, rehearsed until they became fluent. The villagers who noticed dismissed it as odd but harmless, until livestock began to die in ways that raised questions. A cow found stiff in its stall, its eyes wide open, body drained of warmth though no wound marked it. Chickens gone silent, their bodies rigid by dawn. Heinrich swore it was illness, but neighbors whispered that the boys' strange midnight practices had something to do with it. "They are meddling," one farmer muttered in the tavern, "and nothing good comes from meddling." Yet not all who observed agreed it was evil. Some pitied the brothers, seeing only children broken by misfortune, retreating into fantasy to survive their father's cruelty and their mother's absence. Trauma had its language after all, and perhaps, for Carl and Matthias, that language was ritual. But others feared that what began as imagination had become invocation. The idol, the book, the whispers, were these simply the trappings of children reaching for control, or evidence of something older, passed down through bloodlines like a curse. The contrast could not have been sharper. On one hand, ordinary, hardship, hunger, grief, isolation, driving the boys toward symbols of meaning. On the other, the eerie persistence of chants, relics, and rituals too strange to dismiss. Faith blurred into corruption, tradition into obsession. The soil that birthed them was ordinary, but the roots that spread beneath their lives twisted in ways no one could untangle. By their teenage years, Carl and Matthias were inseparable to the point of unease. They rarely spoke to others, and, when they did, their words seemed rehearsed, as though one began a thought and the other finished it. Villagers noted the strange synchronicity in their movements, their eyes often following the same invisible point in the distance. If one fell ill, the other complained of the same symptoms. If one laughed, the other echoed it. They seemed less like two individuals than halves of a single divided being. And always, there were the relics. The book, now with notes scrawled, in their own hands filled with copied Latin they still could not fully translate. The idol, worn smooth where their fingers touched it, its grooves darkened by years of handling. Some claimed to hear them in the fields at night, chanting in unison, their voices blending until it sounded less like brothers and more like a chorus. The villagers grew wary, suspicion hardening into quiet dread. Here, the roots of the so-called pact were already visible, though none could yet name it. Was it born of trauma, a fractured family grasping for meaning where none could be found? Or was it something more deliberate, a turning of grief into devotion, devotion into ritual, and ritual into covenant? What could not be denied was this: the Hollow brothers were no longer merely victims of circumstance. They were architects of something strange, perhaps forbidden, building upon the legacy of relics that should have been forgotten. The origins of their bond with the unknown lay not in sudden madness, but in years of careful, quiet shaping. Their mother's death left them empty. Their father's cruelty left them fearful. Their poverty left them desperate. Into that vacuum slipped the idol, the book, and the rituals that gave them power where they had none. By the time the town began to suspect the Hollow brothers of something darker, the pact, whatever its true nature, had already taken root. It would not be undone by scolding, nor by punishment, nor by pity. It had grown in silence, fed by secrecy, and it was beginning to bloom. The Hollow brothers' childhood was not merely a tale of loss. It was a blueprint of obsession, in the shadows of grief and discipline, in the whispers of rituals both borrowed and invented. The soil of Rottweil nurtured not two ordinary sons, but two men who would come to embody the eternal question: were they broken by life, or chosen by forces beyond it? That uncertainty would linger long after their footsteps vanished from the earth, carried forward not in fact, but in legend. The story of the Hollow brothers might have ended with whispers in barns and relics hidden in dust, but by the early 1830s, the quiet dread surrounding Carl and Matthias began to leak beyond the walls of their home. It started with things small, enough to be dismissed, though small things often carry the weight of warnings. A chicken missing here, a goat falling ill there, tools misplaced, though no one had borrowed them. Such incidents were common in rural Rottweil, where life was harsh, and nature merciless. Yet when neighbors began to notice that these disturbances seemed to cluster around the Hollow farm, murmurs followed. The first undeniable sign arrived one autumn morning. A farmer named Dietrich Bauer found his best milk cow lying lifeless in its stall. There was no wound, no blood, no evidence of predators. Its body was stiff, its eyes wide open, as though death had come suddenly and with purpose. Dietrich had seen foxes, wolves, even thieves take livestock before, but this was different. The animal looked drained, as though something had taken more than its life. The news spread quickly through the town, for livestock was wealth, and to lose one without explanation was not merely a misfortune but an omen. It was not the only case. Within weeks, other farmers reported similar losses: chickens left cold, with no marks upon them, a goat collapsing mid-step as though its breath had been stolen. The pattern became too clear to ignore. Whispers turned into questions, and those questions circled back again and again to the Hollow brothers. "They are meddling with things they should not," muttered one woman outside the church. "They speak to shadows." The Hollow farm itself did little to ease suspicion. At night, villagers claimed to hear sounds drifting from the brothers' barn, low voices chanting in tones too guttural, too rhythmic to be mistaken for simple conversation. Some swore they heard multiple voices at once, layered and overlapping, though no one but Carl and Matthias lived there. A traveling merchant who stayed near the farm one evening told the innkeeper he had heard laughter from the fields, laughter that rose and fell in perfect unison, echoing unnaturally across the night. The merchant left before dawn, unwilling to remain in a town where such things were tolerated. The villagers' unease was heightened by the brothers' strange behavior. Over the years, they had grown not only close, but eerily synchronized. By their early 20s, Carl and Matthias seemed less like individuals and more like mirrors of one another. They finished each other's sentences without hesitation, answered questions in tandem, and sometimes fell into silence so profound it unnerved those in their presence. When one frowned, the other frowned. When one reached for a tool, the other reached for its pair. To outsiders, it appeared as though they shared not just a bond, but a single guiding mind. Such unity might have been dismissed as familial closeness, were it not for the unsettling context in which it appeared. A neighbor once remarked that asking the Hollow brothers a question felt like speaking into a chamber where two voices answered from the same mouth. Another claimed he had seen them move in perfect synchronization while plowing their fields, their steps falling as though choreographed by an unseen hand. "It is not natural," one woman confided during confession, "the way they act. It is as if one soul lives in two bodies." The church took these reports seriously, for to live in such harmony was, paradoxically, seen as unnatural. Priests in Rottweil began to record confessions from parishioners who feared that Carl and Matthias had invited the devil into the town. Father Joseph Keller, the parish priest, noted in his journal that several villagers spoke of rituals in the barn and of shadows where none should be. Though no one could provide proof, the accumulation of fear was proof enough for many. Father Keller himself admitted in his writings that he did not know whether to treat the matter as sin, madness, or something worse. Meanwhile, early physicians who visited the town offered a different interpretation. One doctor, a young man named Friedrich Braun, suggested that the Hollow brothers were displaying symptoms of what he called folie à deux, a shared madness that arises between closely bonded individuals. In his view, the brothers' strange behaviors, their chants, and even the villagers' claims of hearing multiple voices could be explained by psychological contagion. Carl, the elder, might have suffered from delusions, and Matthias, bound to him by grief and dependence, simply adopted them as truth. "What the villagers take for possession," Braun wrote in his notes, "is but the echo of one mind into another." This diagnosis did little to ease the villagers' concerns. To them, the idea of shared madness was no less terrifying than possession. Madness, after all, was not simply illness, it was feared as a kind of corruption, a loss of humanity that could spread like rot. And while Braun argued for observation and treatment, the church demanded vigilance and prayer. The town found itself caught between two explanations, neither of which offered comfort. As the months passed, the disturbances grew bolder. One night, a farmer returning late from market swore he saw shadows flickering inside the Hollow barn, though no lantern burned. Another claimed to hear the sound of animals crying, only to find the brothers' fields silent and empty upon investigation. By now, villagers avoided passing the Hollow property after dark, and even during the day they walked quickly when near it, their eyes fixed on the ground. The Hollow brothers themselves seemed oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the growing fear. They worked their fields as always, silent, unified, their gazes often distant. When questioned about the strange sounds, they gave little reply, only vague statements that deepened suspicion. "We are never alone," Carl once said cryptically to a curious neighbor, a phrase that spread through Rottweil like a curse. The village began to fracture under the weight of the mystery. Some sided with the physicians, arguing that the brothers were victims of delusion, not demons. To them, Carl and Matthias were pitiable, broken men warped by grief and isolation. But others saw only the persistence of unnatural signs, drained animals, unholy chants, shadows without source. For these villagers, the brothers were not victims but servants of something darker. The contrast tore at the community. At Sunday, mass debates simmered beneath the surface, parishioners whispering to one another, even as Father Keller urged unity. In the tavern, arguments erupted between those who blamed superstition and those who swore they had seen proof with their own eyes. Fear began to change the rhythms of daily life. Children were kept indoors after dusk. Doors were barred earlier, each night. The hollow name became one that could not be spoken too loudly, lest it draw unwanted attention. The first signs of what would later be called the Pact were not spectacular, but insidious. Missing chickens, drained livestock, chanting in the dark, shadows in barns, each on its own might have been explained away. But together they formed a pattern too precise to ignore. The Hollow brothers' unity, once perhaps a coping mechanism, now seemed an omen. The villagers could not decide whether the devil had come to Rottweil or whether madness had taken root. But they agreed on one thing. Nothing about the Hollow brothers was ordinary. It is easy, from a distance, to dismiss such stories as exaggerations, the inventions of frightened minds searching for meaning. Perhaps the villagers saw what they expected to see, heard what they feared to hear. Perhaps drained livestock were victims of disease, and the chants were no more than two lonely men repeating words they did not understand. But even skepticism cannot erase the chilling fact that belief itself holds power. The villagers' fear became part of the story, shaping it, feeding it, ensuring that the Hollow brothers would never again be seen as mere men. The first signs were not only warnings of what might come, they were the cracks in the fabric of Rottweil itself. Through them seeped not just dread, but division, as faith battled science, fear battled pity, and superstition battled reason. In the Hollow brothers, the town saw both reflections of their own suffering and symbols of a curse they could not control. Whether victims of delusion or servants of something darker, Carl and Matthias had already transformed. Their story was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to the village, and it was only beginning. By the mid-1830s, the Hollow brothers were no longer merely whispered about in taverns and church pews. They were feared openly. What had begun as strange murmurs of drained livestock and shadowed barns evolved into signs that could not be ignored. Torches were seen burning in their fields at midnight, not in solitary glow but arranged in circles, their flames licking the air in silent choreography. Farmers passing by swore the earth bore scars the next morning. Scorched rings, seared into the soil as though fire had obeyed geometry. No storm, no lantern accident, no ordinary explanation could account for the precision of those patterns. Some villagers claimed the marks looked like wheels of fire, symbols that echoed pagan rites long buried by the church. Others insisted they were warnings, deliberate demonstrations that the Hollow brothers were bound to a power beyond human restraint. It was during this period that the story of Friedrich Hollow, the brother's cousin, entered the legend. Friedrich was not an outsider but kin, a man who had grown up alongside Carl and Matthias before branching away to his own modest farm. Unlike others in Rottweil, he did not flinch at whispers. He believed the brothers were frauds, men using fear to mask failure, inventing darkness where only poverty had cast its shadow. Friedrich spoke loudly at the tavern, mocking the villagers' credulity and vowing to expose whatever trickery the brothers had employed. One evening, Friedrich announced that he would confront Carl and Matthias directly. He told neighbors he would search their barn, uncover the tools behind the supposed rituals, and end the hysteria once and for all. But he never returned. Days passed before search parties dared venture near the Hollow farm. What they found silenced the town. Nailed to the weathered planks of the barn door was Friedrich's cap, soaked in dried blood. Of Friedrich himself there was no trace. The brothers denied all knowledge, their faces calm, their answers clipped. But the message was unmistakable. A man who challenged them had disappeared, and his blood had marked their threshold. From that moment, the Hollow brothers were no longer eccentric farmers. They were predators cloaked in human skin. Fear deepened into paralysis. Neighbors who once muttered accusations now avoided their gaze entirely. Doors were locked with double bars at night. Prayers whispered more fervently. To cross the Hollow brothers was to court disappearance. In silence, the town ceded its power. Stories multiplied, each darker than the last. Some claimed to see the year, brothers carrying slaughtered animals into their fields at night, their hands slick with blood. Others swore that screams, high-pitched animal yet strangely human, echoed from their barn before fading into dreadful silence. When dawn broke, the air was thick with an iron scent that no morning wind could clear. Whether these tales were true or born from fevered imagination mattered little. Belief itself carried the weight of truth, and belief declared that Carl and Matthias Hollow were men bound to a pact sealed in blood. Yet psychology offers a different reading of these events, one that strips away the supernatural but leaves a horror no less chilling. Carl, the elder, had always been the dominant force. He spoke more, decided more, and carried the posture of command. Matthias, quieter, softer, mirrored him to the point of erasure. Their relationship fit a pattern later recognized as coercion and submission, one mind exerting its will until the other became an extension of it. In this light, the so-called rituals might have been the expressions of Carl's unraveling psyche, with Matthias serving as both accomplice and captive. What villagers took for unified devotion to the devil may have been the echo of one man's madness reverberating through another. Still, this explanation does not account for Friedrich's fate. Psychosis may lead to violence, but it does not nail bloodied caps to barn doors as though issuing warnings. It does not create scorched circles in the soil, observed by multiple witnesses. Unless, of course, one considers another layer of psychology, intimidation. To maintain control, fear must be fed. The Hollow brothers, whether mad or calculating, may have staged these spectacles deliberately, ritual theater designed, to terrify their neighbors into silence. A dead cousin becomes more than family tragedy. It becomes a symbol, a warning etched in blood and wood. And yet, even if staged, such acts did not diminish the villagers' terror. They heightened it. To them, the Hollow brothers were no longer human in the ordinary sense. They had become vessels of something deeper, something hungering. Power and blood were indistinguishable. Each new disappearance, each new scorch mark in the fields, seemed to testify that the pact, whether real or imagined, demanded sacrifice. One farmer recalled in later testimony that he saw Carl standing in the field one moonless night, his arms stretched wide, Matthias kneeling beside him. The farmer insisted he heard chanting, though he could not discern the words. It was not German, he said, and it was not Latin either. It was a sound that made the hair rise on my arms as though it came from a place I should not know. He fled before they could see him, and though he admitted he could not prove what he had witnessed, he never again passed by their land. By this stage, the Hollow brothers had achieved a kind of dominion over Rottweil. They held no office, bore no weapons, commanded no armies. Yet their power was palpable. Fear is the most efficient ruler, and fear requires only belief. In the taverns, villagers spoke cautiously, lowering voices at the mention of their names. At the church, Father Keller implored his flock to resist superstition, to place faith in God over fear of men, but even his sermons carried tremors of uncertainty. He could not explain the scorch marks. He could not explain Friedrich's absence. The doctors, too, fell silent. Friedrich Braun, once vocal in his theory of shared psychosis, retreated from the case after Friedrich Hollow's disappearance. His notes reveal a shift in tone. I cannot persuade them, he wrote of the townsfolk. The fear is too deep. The Hollow brothers have become myth before my eyes. To insist on medicine now is to shout into the wind. In that admission lies the essence of the brothers' transformation. Whether possessed, mad, or manipulative, They had crossed into the realm of legend. The escalation of their rituals reflected this transformation. What may have begun as whispers in barns evolved into public displays, torches in fields, chants loud enough to reach neighboring farms, the visible marks of fire on earth. Each act blurred the boundary between performance and belief. Were the brothers still seeking power for themselves, or had they become instruments of something greater, bound to rituals whose meanings even they no longer fully understood? Here lies the crux of the question. Were Carl and Matthias hollow predators, or were they prey? If Carl led and Matthias followed, then both were trapped in a dance spiraling toward destruction. If their rituals were performance, then they were enslaved to the need for ever greater displays to maintain their aura of terror. And if, as many in Rottweil feared, their pact was real, then they were not the masters of their fate at all. They were servants, bound by blood to something that demanded more than they could give. The tragedy of Friedrich's disappearance marked the point of no return. Before, the brothers might have been eccentric, frightening, suspicious. After, they were untouchable. No villager dared confront them again. Isolation became armor, fear their fortress. And within that fortress, power and madness fermented together, indistinguishable from one another. In the end, the story of this chapter is not only about blood spilled and power seized. It is about the fragility of a community when faced with mystery. The Hollow brothers may have orchestrated their reputation deliberately, or they may have been consumed by forces, psychological, supernatural, or both, that they could not resist. But what cannot be denied is this: Rottweil itself became their stage. The soil bore their signs, the barns their warnings, the villagers their chorus of silence. Blood had been offered, power had been claimed, and the pact, whatever it was, had stepped out of rumor and into reality. By 1840, the Hollow brothers were no longer spoken of as wayward farmers or eccentric kin. In the eyes of Rottweil, they had transformed into something monstrous, figures not merely feared but reviled, the very embodiment of corruption and dread. Their once modest farm, a place where wheat and barley had grown in lean years, now stood as a forbidden zone. Families who lived on the outskirts of the town began to sell their land for fractions of its worth, unwilling to raise children in the shadow of the Hollow farm. The once busy road that cut past their fields fell silent. Merchants preferred longer routes through rocky hills rather than cross near the brothers' home. Silence, avoidance, and dread became the only currencies spoken in that corner of Rottweil. The Hollow house itself became a kind of monument to terror. Windows that once overlooked fields were boarded over with rough planks, not hammered in neatly but nailed at crooked angles, as if sealing in something that should not look upon the outside world. Smoke rose from the chimney at odd hours, not the steady plume of hearth fire but sudden choking bursts carrying with them the odor of tar, sulfur, and sometimes sweet decay. On nights when the moon was full, villagers whispered of sounds emanating from within, voices that rose in languages unknown, sometimes in harsh guttural syllables, sometimes in lilting tones like song. To those who dared creep close enough, it was not merely the sound of two men. It was the sound of many, as though a congregation of invisible presences gathered within the Hollow walls. The church could not ignore such reports. Father Keller, who had long tried to reassure his flock, found his own confidence shaken. He recorded in his journal that the brothers have fallen into mockery of holy things, scorning what is sacred, delighting in blasphemy. At last, a small delegation was sent. 2 priests from a nearby monastery, men accustomed to confronting heresy and, when necessary, performing rites of exorcism. Their arrival was met with hushed anticipation by the villagers, who followed at a distance, too fearful to approach directly but desperate to know what transpired. The priests entered the Hollow farm at dusk. They were not seen again until dawn. When they emerged, their faces were pale, their eyes sunken, and their voices carried the tremor of men who had seen more than they wished to speak. Yet fragments of their testimony survive. One priest wrote that when he began to recite scripture, the brothers laughed, not merely a mocking chuckle but a deep resonant laughter that seemed to echo unnaturally within the walls. And then, With flawless pronunciation, Carl began to recite the same scripture back to him, in Latin so perfect it matched the liturgy of trained scholars. The priest insisted that the brothers had never studied formally, nor had they traveled beyond their village. What scholar taught them this tongue? He asked in despair. Or else, who whispered it into their ears? The second priest claimed the brothers spoke of sins they could not possibly know. He described how Matthias turned to him and recited, word for word, a private confession he had once given years earlier at another monastery, in another town entirely. The details were exact, intimate, and known only to himself and the confessor, who had since died. No man alive could have told him, he wrote, and yet he knew. This was enough for the church to press for an exorcism. Preparations were made, prayers drawn up, relics gathered. Yet when the priests returned to perform the rite, they found the hollow farm abandoned. The doors were unbarred, the smoke had ceased, and inside the rooms lay in disarray. Broken furniture, overturned stools, straw scattered as if a struggle had taken place. But the brothers were gone. Some claimed they had fled into the woods. Others whispered they had melted into the very shadows of the house, absorbed by the darkness they once courted. While the church moved swiftly to condemn them as heretics and vessels of the demonic, physicians once again offered their rebuttal. Dr. Friedrich Braun, though shaken by earlier encounters, returned to his writings with renewed determination. He argued that the Hollow brothers' behaviors matched known symptoms of epilepsy and schizophrenia, the sudden laughter, the mimicry of voices, the appearance of secret knowledge drawn from overheard conversations. He suggested their uncanny unity was a form of folie à deux, madness shared between two closely bonded individuals. In such cases, one dominant personality imposes delusions upon the other until both live in the same constructed world. To Braun, there was no demon in the Hollow farm, only two broken minds locked in a spiral of delusion. Yet Braun himself admitted unease. There remains, he wrote, the inexplicable knowledge of private sins. His medical rationalism faltered here. How could two illiterate farmers know the inner confessions of priests, the hidden shames of villagers, the intimate fears of those who never spoke them aloud? Unless, he suggested uneasily, those villagers had unknowingly revealed such details in casual conversation, which the brothers then twisted into prophecy, but even he confessed this explanation felt inadequate. The town, however, did not think in medical terms. To them, the distinction between madness and possession was meaningless. What mattered was the effect. The Hollow brothers brought terror, desecration, and a sense of intrusion into the most private recesses of conscience. Madness could be pitied, treated, perhaps cured. But possession demanded eradication. Thus, Rottweil divided along fault lines. The devout demanded holy intervention, convinced that only exorcism and fire could cleanse the land. The educated, few as they were, urged restraint, calling for the brothers to be confined in an asylum, studied, and perhaps rehabilitated. Between these camps lay the silent majority, who simply wanted the Hollow brothers gone by any means, so that life might return to its former, quieter rhythm. And yet, both priests and physicians shared a haunting commonality: unease. For in all their encounters, one detail stood out. The Hollow brothers seemed always aware, always watching. They knew not only sins but secrets, a farmer's hidden debts, a woman's concealed affair, a child's theft of bread from the altar. None of these things had been spoken aloud in the brothers' presence, yet they knew. Some dismissed this as coincidence, others as manipulation. But to those who experienced it firsthand, it was evidence of something invasive, something that penetrated the barrier between thought and speech. Madness alone could not explain it, nor could faith fully contain it. As weeks stretched into months, the Hollow farm remained a place of dread. Travelers swore they saw flickering lights in the boarded windows, though no smoke rose from the chimney. On stormy nights, some claimed to hear voices again, chanting, laughing, even weeping. Whether the brothers still lived there in hiding, or whether the house itself had absorbed their presence, no one could say. But no villager dared cross the threshold. It stood as both a ruin and a monument, a theater where fear itself played the lead. Here the contrast between madness and possession collapses into ambiguity. For what is possession if not a mind overtaken, a will surrendered, a body used as instrument? And what is madness, if not a voice speaking where no voice should be, a knowledge unearned, a perception distorted? In the Hollow Brothers, the two possibilities converged so tightly that no clear boundary remained. Were they men consumed by disease of the mind, or men hollowed out to make space for something else entirely? The villagers could not decide, nor could the priests, nor even the physicians. The Hollow Brothers had become a paradox given flesh, madness that felt like possession, possession that looked like madness, and so the legend grew. Rottweil, once known for its fertile fields and quiet life, became a place spoken of in hushed tones across neighboring towns. Travelers carried tales of the Hollow Brothers, stories embroidered with each telling, of men who laughed in the face of scripture, of voices that spoke with many tongues, of knowledge that pierced the soul. Some insisted they were demons in disguise. Others said they were prophets, cursed with sight into the hidden rot of human hearts. Still others whispered that they were neither, that they had simply stepped too far into the abyss of the mind, and in doing so, had become something unrecognizable. By the close of 1840, the Hollow Brothers were no longer mere men of flesh and bone. In the eyes of their contemporaries, they had transcended into something symbolic, a mirror reflecting humanity's deepest fears, that the mind may betray itself, that faith may falter, and that the line between sanity and damnation is far thinner than anyone wishes to admit. Their farm was no longer simply a patch of earth, but a stage upon which this struggle played out, between science and superstition, between medicine and theology, between madness and possession. And in that struggle, no victor emerged. Only questions remained. For perhaps the truth died with Carl and Matthias Hollow. Or perhaps it still lingers, sealed behind those boarded windows, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to look within. The story of the Hollow Brothers does not end neatly, for the truth of their fate is as fractured and uncertain as the lives they led. In some accounts, written decades later in brittle parish records, it is said that the villagers at last gathered, their courage, storming the brothers' barn after hearing unholy chanting that rattled through the valley like thunder. When the doors were forced open, the onlookers did not find two men cowering in fear, but a chamber transformed into a grotesque altar. Symbols were carved across the walls in blood, some resembling crude crosses turned upside down, others spirals, and runes no scholar could later identify. The floor, too, bore dark stains that no amount of water or lime could erase. But the brothers themselves were not captured alive. In this version of events, they were dragged out, bound, and delivered into the hands of church officials who locked them away in a monastery cell. There their voices continued until their dying breaths, echoing through stone corridors, a chorus that unsettled even hardened monks. Another tradition, equally persistent, tells a different story. According to these whispers, no villagers ever caught the brothers because there was nothing left to catch. Instead, one stormy night, a fire erupted in the Hollow farm. Flames consumed the barn and house alike, so sudden and so intense that it seemed less like an accident and more like an act of destruction from within. When dawn came, all that remained was ash, blackened beams, and the faint outline of scorched symbols pressed into the earth. No bodies were ever found. To some, this was proof of their escape, that Carl and Matthias fled into the forests, living as outcasts until death claimed them. To others, it was evidence of something more chilling, that they had been claimed, not by earthly flames but by the very pact they had forged. Still other accounts blurred the two tales together, suggesting the brothers had indeed been captured, but their imprisonment was short-lived. According to these darker retellings, monks tasked with guarding them began to whisper and dream, their minds unraveling in the brothers' presence. One by one the monks fell ill, some raving, some silent, some vanishing without explanation. Within a year the monastery was abandoned, and the records of the brothers' supposed confinement were sealed. Whether this was an attempt at mercy, secrecy, or suppression, no one can say. What is certain is not how the Hollow brothers ended, but how they endured in memory. Long after their farm was gone, long after the fields had grown over with grass, their names lingered. In Rottweil, mothers whispered the story of the Hollow brothers to frighten children into obedience. Do not wander past dusk. Do not mock the holy. Do not keep secrets with your kin that turn into curses. Fathers invoked the brothers as examples of greed and ambition, men who sought power not meant for mortal hands. Priests spoke of them as warnings against pride, against turning from God to false idols. But folklore rarely obeys the Church's tidy moral boundaries. In the telling and retelling, the Hollow brothers transformed. Some tales painted them not merely as villains but as victims. Two men crushed by poverty, abandoned by community, driven to desperation, and in their hunger for survival, lured into shadows too deep to escape. In these stories, they became tragic figures cursed not by choice but by fate. Others, however, gave them a darker nobility, visionaries who discovered forbidden truths and paid the price for daring to touch them. The brothers were not only monsters, they were martyrs of forbidden knowledge punished for revealing that reality is not as stable as it appears. By the late 19th century, psychologists revisiting local legends began to interpret the Hollow brothers' case as a textbook example of folie à deux, shared psychosis. Medical journals of the era, fascinated by the strange interplay of dominance and submission between Karl and Matthias, dissected the story as though it were a clinical experiment. Here were two brothers, bound by blood and isolation, amplifying each other's delusions until the line between reality and fantasy dissolved entirely. To the physicians, the rituals, the voices, the symbols carved into walls were less supernatural acts than desperate attempts by fractured minds to impose meaning on a hostile world. Karl, the elder, had imposed his vision. Matthias, the younger, had followed it until it became his own. Madness spread between them like a contagion, each reinforcing the other until they spiraled into destruction. Yet even these rationalists admitted the story had features that resisted easy diagnosis. The knowledge the brothers demonstrated, the secrets they spoke aloud, the languages they seemed to recite, remained troubling. Some suggested these details were exaggerations born of fear and gossip. Others admitted there may have been more to the case than delusion alone. The Hollow brothers became, in the medical world, a boundary case, a story cited in papers, debated at conferences, yet never fully explained. For the Church, the brothers remained an open wound. Records of their investigation were preserved, in archives carefully worded yet brimming with unease. Priests who encountered the case were divided. Some insisted it was a clear example of possession, 7 demons bound into 2 bodies, mocking God until their destruction. Others worried that the Hollow brothers had stumbled upon rituals older than Christianity, remnants of pagan practices that never truly died in the Black Forest region. To them, the brothers were not possessed but initiated, conduits of a tradition the Church could not recognize but instinctively feared. In this reading, the pact had not ended with their disappearance. It had merely shifted, waiting for new heirs. Such fears found fertile soil in local superstition. To this day, some residents of Rottweil insist the Hollow fields are cursed. No matter how many times farmers tried to cultivate them, the soil resisted, crops withering where once they flourished. Hunters avoid the area after dusk, claiming the silence of the woods is too heavy, too watchful. Travelers report hearing laughter on the wind, low and mocking, when they cross the fields by moonlight. And every few years, stories resurface of symbols found carved into bark or scratched into stone, spirals, crosses, shapes that echo the old accounts of the brothers' rituals. Whether these are the work of pranksters or something more, no one dares to say aloud. The Hollow brothers in death became more than men. They became myth. And myth, unlike flesh, does not decay. It spreads, changes, and lodges itself in the marrow of a community. Their legend has been retold in taverns, in hushed conversations, in academic papers and sermons, and in the frightened whispers of children. Each telling shapes them anew, but the core remains. Two brothers, bound by blood, consumed by power, and lost to forces beyond comprehension. What makes their story endure is not certainty but ambiguity. If they were mere madmen, their tale would belong in dusty medical journals, forgotten by all but scholars. If they were mere heretics, their fate would be another footnote in the Church's long war against deviation. But because their story straddles both possibilities, madness and possession, delusion and ritual, it lingers. It resists closure. It refuses to be pinned down. That refusal is precisely what gives it power. For in the Hollow Brothers, every listener finds what they most fear. The faithful see proof of the devil's presence. The rationalist sees the terrifying fragility of the human mind. The skeptic sees the danger of hysteria and rumor, how communities can destroy their own in fear. And the dreamer sees the possibility that the world holds shadows not yet mapped, secrets not yet explained, voices not yet silenced. This is the legacy of fear, not the deeds themselves, but the questions they leave behind. How thin is the line between kinship and curse? How easily does loyalty transform into submission? How fragile is the mind when left alone in the dark? The Hollow Brothers remind us that the boundary between sanity and madness, between faith and heresy, between humanity and monstrosity is perilously thin, and once crossed, it may never be walked back. Even now, nearly 2 centuries later, the brothers linger in imagination. Their farm is gone, their bodies lost, their voices silenced, or so we believe. But in the fields of Rottweil, the grass grows in uneven patches, and on certain nights the wind seems to carry not only its own whisper but another layered within it. Some say the brothers are gone. Others say they wait, unseen, until the world is ready to hear them again. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of all. Not the rituals they performed, not the fear they inspired, but the silence they left behind. Silence that feels less like absence and more like a pause, before something speaks once more. The story of the Hollow Brothers lingers because it resists the closure that most histories crave. For every attempt to categorize them, to place them neatly within the boundaries of madness, heresy, or folklore, another detail unsettles the frame. They were poor, yes, driven by hunger and isolation into a spiral of secrecy. But poverty alone does not explain the symbols carved with precision into their walls, or the way strangers swore the brothers' spoken voices not their own. They may have been delusional, but delusion cannot account for the cousin who vanished without trace, or the fires that left ruins where once fields had thrived. They may have been heretics, but heresy does not leave scars in soil that refuses to grow crops centuries later. And so the Hollow Brothers slip through every explanation like smoke, becoming something larger than the facts that tried to contain them. To the Church, they were souls lost to darkness, evidence that pride and disobedience allow the devil to walk openly among men. To physicians, they were victims of folie à deux, a chilling portrait of how tightly human minds can entangle, until neither knows where one ends and the other begins. To villagers, they became a living curse, invoked in whispers to frighten children away from disobedience or from wandering into the fields after dusk. But the Hollow Brothers' true power lies not in how they were judged then, but in how their story still refuses to die now. Each version of their fate, captured, burned, vanished, carries its own truth, none more definitive than the others. Every retelling adds another layer to the myth, a reminder that the line between memory and imagination is as fragile as the line between sanity and madness. Their bond as brothers remains the most haunting element of all. That unbreakable tie, so fierce that it seemed to eclipse the outside world, became both their salvation and their doom. Bound together, they shut out every voice but their own, until those voices merged into something neither wholly human nor wholly imagined. Was it only blood and trauma that sealed their pact, or did they truly become vessels of something older, something waiting for kin strong enough or broken enough to carry it forward? In their silence, in their ambiguity, lies their enduring, terror. Perhaps in the end, the Hollow brothers were only men, frightened, desperate, consumed by an obsession that stripped them of reason. Or perhaps they were never merely men at all, but shadows wearing human faces, borrowed vessels for a hunger that outlives generations. Whatever the truth, it has never been unearthed. What remains is the story itself, unanswered, unresolvable, a legend that has endured because it cannot be pinned down. And perhaps that is the truest mark of their legacy, that we still tell their story, still search the silence they left behind, wondering if, one day, it will speak again.